All right, folks, welcome back to the channel and back to the Hickory Hacker Museum. Have a different camera angle for you this time to show you a different part of the museum. And I'm sitting in the St. Andrews department right here. Two pictures basically of St. Andrews and Alan Robertson right there over my shoulder. But I want to do another question and answer video this week. And specifically, it's a question that I get a lot from new collectors who find clubs in the wild. And it is, what is the metal shaft cap that they're finding, and how can they find more of them so that they can put them on more clubs? It's an obvious question because, you know, you come across these clubs and you see this metal shaft cap and you wonder, why don't all the clubs have this? Because it seems like a pretty cool decorative piece that must be indicative of a nicer club. And what I end up explaining to them is that it's the opposite. It's actually indicative of the cheapest kind of club you could have found back in the day. These caps are often found on economy line clubs that were sold in retail stores. And so when you find them as a collector and as a player, you start to learn that they were basically characteristics of the cheapest clubs that were sold at the time. What that means is that the materials used in the club are often the lowest grade that a club maker would have, or a company would have used for a club. So the leather shaft, or I'm sorry, the leather grip is often very thin. Sometimes it's even like paper, so when you scrape it off or try to unwrap it, it just falls apart into pieces. And often the wood used, the hickory wood for the shaft, wasn't quite the quality that you would have found in a nicer club. And the way to figure that out would be to count the grain lines, which most of the time, when you come across these clubs with the shaft caps, they obscure the end of the grain, so you can't actually see how many lines are in it. We'll talk a little bit more about the quality of the shafts underneath those caps in a second. But yeah, what the companies would do is, you know, kind of decorate it a little bit nicer than the better quality clubs you would have found from your local club pro, and tried to make it look a little bit nicer than it was to entice people to buy them. What you'll often see on the clubs that have these shafts are heads that have chromium finishes, so they're shiny. They might have fancy names on them like Wentworth and other things like that, just to try to market them to be a little bit, you know, to look nicer than they actually were. So from a collectibles perspective, you know, they made a ton of these clubs in general, and they made a lot of economy line clubs. And so there's not a lot of collectible value to the clubs, but from a playability perspective, some of them actually are decent players, or at least have good enough swing weight to warrant building a beginner set around. So when people find these clubs, you know, one of the things that they want to do is try to, you know, put together a set. And, you know, the other aspect of these metal capped clubs is that they are often sold as part of matched sets. So we understand as collectors and players of Hickory golf clubs that when you start talking or seeing clubs that say matched on them or have the yardages on them that they were meant for, or even numbers, those are all indicative of late Hickory era clubs. So we're talking about clubs that were made in the late 1920s, early 1930s. And generally speaking, when you come across the clubs with all those terms like matched, chromium, some weird name, there isn't like maybe a company name, but just like Argyle, or, you know, just a whole bunch of different names. And then you see the shaft cap. You're looking at what a club that would have been sold in a retail setting, not one that you would have gotten from your pro at the golf course. So they're still totally playable. You know, you can still do all the same work on them. It is a little trickier removing this cap, and that gets us to the question, which is, how do I find those caps to replace them on shafts that they don't have, that they're not on, which is a mouthful that I can't say apparently. My answer to that question is they're pretty much near impossible to remove without destroying. Basically, the way to get these off, they're so tight, is that you have to kind of find a little gap, and then I use a flathead screwdriver and just start prying the metal off. It's made out of a thin aluminum, so once you get underneath it and start turning the screwdriver, you can actually peel it up pretty quick and pretty easy. They don't really serve much of a functional purpose, at least the cheapest ones you find. This one that I have right here is purely decorative. I suppose there might have been some functionality for certain players to have the their grip close to it, so it kind of gave them something to stop against. So I suppose that's a functional aspect, but they didn't do anything to keep the grip on. Most of the time when I take these off, there's still a nail that or a tack that's securing the grip to the shaft. So it's not like I see this used to keep the grip on. At least not in this case with this one that doesn't have any, that's basically just the cap. So yeah, you take this off, and once you do that, it's pretty much destroyed. You've peeled it up, and you can't put that back on another club. So I never find them outside or loose of a shaft and capable of putting back on. And even if you did, I'm not quite sure how you would get it on without destroying it, because you'd have to try to stretch it a little bit to get it over the grip. And usually what ends up happening is when I come across these kinds of shafts, I want to remove the grip anyway and replace the grip because it's usually one of these paper thin leather, cheap leather grips. And once you get up to the cap, you pretty much have to just pry that off, and then the cap is toast. One exception to that is this particular one, which again, this is probably a lower grade club that would have been sold in a retail setting. However, it's a little bit nicer of a cap, and I think this is probably like a mid-grade. And in fact, this particular cap has a patent date on it. So I think that the purpose of this, there actually was a functional purpose to this particular cap. You can see that there's a tack that goes through the metal, and then the grain is actually exposed at the top of the cap. So I think this was probably made in an effort to, to put the cap on there, actually to functionally keep the grip in place as well, and then also show the grain of the club so that a better player would pick this up off a shelf and be able to see the grain of the shaft to determine if it was a decent quality shaft. And it is a better quality shaft. It's stiff, and the other thing about these is that because they're coming from the late Hickory era, relatively speaking, they're not that old. They're the youngest kind of hickory clubs you're going to come across. So the wood is still in pretty good shape for the most part, unless it's been just stored in horrendous conditions. So I use these shafts all the time. There are certain instances where you'll come across, especially clubs that have this fully enclosed cap. And when you take that cap off, you'll see that there's maybe only 4 or 5 growth rings in the end grain, which is an indicator of a fairly young hickory wood, and not as strong as you would normally want in a golf shaft. You usually want the more lines that you see in the end grain, the higher quality, or the older it is and the stronger it is. So that goes back to what I said earlier, which is that these clubs were meant for retail settings, and so the materials they were using on them were the cheapest they had. And they were trying to make the most money off of these as they could. So you're not going to find stellar quality materials in these, but you'll still find completely playable clubs. And if you just do the work to get them back into playing shape, they'll be fine beginners clubs for you. Though I will say, like any golf club, even the ones today, if you go to Walmart and you buy a set of irons and you compare those to the newest set from Titleist or Callaway or TaylorMade, you're going to notice a difference in playability and feel. And that's kind of the same with the clubs that you find attached to these shafts. They're perfectly suitable for getting around the course, but you're going to find a better experience in some of the better quality heads that were made, and definitely find better quality shafts and the feel from a better quality shaft versus this, which is essentially kind of a mop stick or a broomstick attached to a club head. So it sounds like I'm being overly disparaging about these clubs. I just want to emphasize that most of the time when you find these metal shaft caps, you're looking at the cheapest club that particular club maker was making in the late Hickory era. And most collectors don't want to see this cap. Well, I shouldn't say that. I think there are collectors out there who kind of like the challenge of putting together these match sets of retail line and economy line clubs. And in those instances, you want to try to find them as complete and original as possible, so you want to see that cap. Which also, alludes to the question that people have, when they're putting together their first set and they see some of their clubs have this cap and some of them don't, they assume that they need to find shafts that have these caps, or at least the cap themselves, so they can put them on their shafts. So I've already answered that it's pretty much impossible to take this cap off and put it on another shaft without damaging it. But what I will say is, if your intent is to try to build a match set of clubs that have a uniform appearance, and you want to have the cap on all of them, then the best bet is to collect these shafts from other heads that you don't want, and then just reshaft them on the heads that you do want. There's collectors of everything, and you can get pretty particular in how you collect these clubs. And so that would be my recommendation. If you just want them to look at and you want to put them on display, and you want them to be, want them to look all the same, then that would be how you'd go about doing that. But trying to remove them and put them on another shaft is pretty much impossible. And like I said, I never find them apart from a shaft in a condition that you'd be able to put them on. And even if you did, you'd probably damage it getting it back on a different shaft. Now, there are exceptions to everything. And what you're going to find as you start collecting more clubs is that not all of them were the cheapest. Not all of the clubs you find with these caps were the cheapest of that particular maker. Grand Slam, which was the top of the line club for Hickory and Bradsby in the 1920s, had a very ornate shaft cap that had the logo for the Grand Slam on it, and just really cool, intricate. I think it was made out of brass. I've had those clubs before. I don't have any right now to show you. But that is just a way, just to tell you that sometimes shaft caps were actually put on better quality clubs. And so the Grand Slam is an example of that. I've actually collected over the years some other different kinds of shaft caps that are different than this standard aluminum cap. Great Lakes made one that was basically like a large push pin, and that one just hammered into the butt end of the shaft and served the same kind of purpose as these do, but it was a little bit different and had the Great Lakes name on it. I've found McGregor ones that have a screw hole in the middle of it, and those just screw into the butt end of the shaft. You'll also find then instances of caps that looked a little bit nicer than just this normal one that has nothing written on it. Draper Maynard out of New Hampshire put all their information on the cap of their clubs. So there were ways to kind of make these look a little bit nicer, and there were some companies that used them on better quality clubs. But generally speaking, when you come across these metal shaft caps, you're looking at the lowest grade club of a particular maker, and it doesn't mean you can't play the club. But that is, if you thought that you were finding something that was a little bit rare or more interesting, you fell into the marketing trap of these companies that they were using back in the day to try to entice people to think that they were buying something a little bit nicer than they were. Now, that is my experience with these. If anybody watches this video and has more information about these caps or has some examples of other higher quality clubs with these caps, I'd love to see them. This is what I have in my particular collection, and there's always more information out there to glean about this stuff. So what I'm telling you is not the full story, most likely. There's probably other companies that have used these caps in the past, and there may be different stories or reasons for why they did that than what I described to you today. But I think, generally speaking, the caps that you come across are going to fit the narrative that I just laid out for you. And yeah, like I said, if you have any other questions about this, feel free to reach out, and I'll entertain any other questions you have about Hickory clubs, and I'll do a video on it if I get that question enough. Thanks for watching, folks. We'll see you next time. Take care.